Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me now. Apologies for that problem, which I think was at my end. I'd like to start the presentation with some comments really about the extent of the supply chain crisis at the moment. And whilst in general, it's fair to say that supply chains are pretty flexible, however convoluted and complex they might be, no one could be prepared for COVID-19 and its impacts on your supply chain or any supply chain. And I think that's best evidenced really by a recent Institute for Supply Management, the ISM, who found that 75% of SME manufacturing businesses in the UK had been disrupted by the crisis. And more worrying than that, 44% had no sort of plan to deal with the crisis yet. So as the crisis has evolved and deepened, we've been conducting our own activity within the Manufacturing Growth Programme and our own research. And I think it's fair to say that companies are affected in a sort of broad spectrum of ways. Some are certainly experiencing unprecedented demand, and that impact on their supply chain is that they're not able to maintain production and not able to produce and supply anything to their customers. Others are decimated in terms of there are no orders and there's no need for a supply chain because there's no orders that they need to fulfill. And that their supply chain has cut off, and they've cut off their own manufacturing activity, and as have their customers. Most, however, I think it's fair to say, are caught somewhere between the two extremes, and I think that's the majority of what I'd like to talk about today are probably companies who are in that category. But I think it's fair to say from the 150, 160 or so companies that we've spoken to, those that develop some sort of target-orientated action plans and then have a framework in which they can execute them might be able to cope better and be in a stronger position, both to cope with the current crisis and to survive it and come out perhaps stronger. So, as I said, we've spoken to just under 150 companies in the last 6 weeks or so. And the format in which we engage with these companies takes the form of a crisis action report. And the primary objective of that is to assess the key pain points that drives their own prioritization. So it's important that people don't feel that they have to do everything that they would normally do, but have some prioritized action plans to deal with their key pain points, be that cash flow, access to finance, be it social distancing, work practices, whatever it might be, but have some targeted action plans to deal with each of them. But in general, the feedback from SMEs when we talk about the supply chain focuses on two things, and it's really tightening the connection between supply and demand, whatever your size. I mean, we're talking about companies with 230, 240 employees down to people with 3 or 4. And then understanding what inventory is critical to you and to your customers. So really tightening up that whole cycle and mechanism. And in doing so, you'll have a better understanding of what your customers' priorities are vital and what they require. And I think we've also found that those companies who have a stronger supply chain, so those that are they operate very dynamically on real-time information, and it's something that they did anyway, even before the crisis. They're very, very engaged and interrelated with both their client base and their customer base, and I think that has to be a lesson really going forward and trying to cope with the current impacts. For the larger manufacturers, those sort of over 150, 200 employees, we are seeing an increasing interest in automation and intelligent workflows based on that data, so that they're able to more easily adjust their supply chains and contract them and expand them as required to meet the new demand levels, whether they be higher or lower. And certainly that also applies to smaller customers who will need to better integrate their forecasting and liaison. However that takes place, that needs to be something that is really tightened up. what we've developed from our engagement with companies is a really what we call a cycle of risk analysis. And from that, developing a framework, which I'll talk about shortly, and how to respond to those in an operational context. Now, the cycle of risk generally has to deal with the supply shocks. In other words, your disruption in the availability of your raw materials or goods, unfinished and finished, that are coming into your facility. The demand shocks, those companies that had to, were exposed by panic buying and weren't able to meet that demand. Very often the customers would therefore go elsewhere. And we're now starting to have engagement with companies about what we would call the aftershocks, which is what will be, will there be a return to normal, or will we continue to see waves of buying, and then trying to find some means to predict what those might be. A lot of people are talking about returning to normal. We would consider that to be the prospect more likely to be a new normal. And the impact of that can be, it's worth being aware of, something called the inventory bounce, which is you think the new normal is a very high demand and you adjust your supply chain to cope with that, and then everything goes flat again. So, that can also have an impact on what's referred to as supply chain shrinkage. And that particularly affects people who are receiving goods from China and India and overseas, perhaps to look at more localized sourcing. But the most important thing for all these things is to create a planning framework that prioritizes activities and not just try and do everything, absolute prioritization, and seek outside help if required. MGP grant support is still available, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the companies that we've seen and recognise are seeming to cope better and that fall into that middle ground I mentioned are people that have a framework to monitor their activity on a daily, weekly, and they're on a monthly basis, although we're only 6 weeks in really, in a very simple spreadsheet format, which contains all their tactical responses and allocates the responsibility for the reaction to those operational requirements to individuals within the business. The crisis action framework I mentioned that we've now conducted 150 across the SEMLEP area. The feedback we've had in terms of their how they're coping with the crisis broadly correlates with the ISM survey. About 75% are affected, and more than half of those negatively, and only about 30–40% have any sort of plan to deal with it. So our crisis monitoring tool, which I'll show you in a moment, deals with the supply shock to your business and actually itemizing, writing down what that shock is and measuring it. The business demand shock, so not just what's coming into your business, but what your customers require of you, and then having your own forecast for a return to work. I've been dealing with a company yesterday who have a very, very clear forecast from their 19 customers about what those customers require if certain criteria and announcements are met by the government in terms of being allowed to return to manufacturing activity. And then try and forecast, and obviously these things are changeable, what you consider to be the new normal of your own and your customer base. And that ought to minimize shocks within your own future supply chain. So the crisis action report template, there's just a sample of that, is something that I'm very happy to do with any SME manufacturers who want to contact me, and I'll give my details afterwards, that runs through, lists the key pain points within the business. It looks at cash flow, how long that cash flow can continue to support the business. It provides referrals to other support networks, whether it be SEMLEP or Chambers of Commerce, about what support is available. But the key output of that is a tabulated report that hopefully provides it's a list of 5 or 6 key priorities that have to be monitored on that daily, weekly basis that I referred to earlier. Now, grant support is available to assist with some of that activity should you wish to engage a third-party external resource to help you with that. We're obviously operating remotely, but otherwise that grant support is available as normal. Engaging third parties to help with a planning and a project activity during the crisis is 33% for revenue projects to support a £3,000 to £6,000 spend by you. And there's also some support for CapEx projects up to 25,000. As I say, it's remote, not face-to-face. We use an online assessment tool, which is called Growth Mapper. Only one supplier is required. It's not a three-quote system. And after the issue of the grant offer letter, there are 4 months in which to claim. Those are my contact details. If anybody would like to contact me afterwards for me to have a personal one-to-one crisis action report, then I'd be more than happy to undertake that for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Adrian. So before we move on to Jim's presentation, does anybody have any questions? If you do, then please feel free to use the chat section and we can put those to Adrian before we move on. But if not, Jim, if you'd like to get your presentation ready, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready if Adrian can stop his screen share, if you're ready to move on.
There you are, Jim, that should be ready to go now. If you have any questions, you know, for Adrian, we can come back to those after Jim's done his, okay?
Thank you very much, Sam. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Semilet for inviting me to talk to you all today. My name is Jim Fanshawe. I run a company called Your Export Department, which pretty much does what it says on the tin. I wanted to talk to you about two separate things really today, though they are clearly linked, but the presentation will have two phases to it. The first one really, the first phase really, I'll give you a quick review and an overview really of the situation in terms of the physical movement of goods, both import and export this applies to. So I'll have a look at a bit of the situation in ports and with freight movement generally. And hopefully that will give you a picture. I'm sure it probably reflects the things that you're seeing at the moment in relation to your imports and your exports of goods. And then the second phase, I wanted to try and leave you with a tool because a lot of people I'm talking to at the moment are taking some time at the moment to review their business generally. So I thought maybe it would be useful if I shared with you a tool that I use to help you review target markets and the selection of target markets, and we can build in an element of COVID-19 impact analysis onto that methodology. So for a bit of scene setting, really, in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about in relation to the movement of goods, just to set the scene. I've based this on what I'm hearing from both clients of mine who I'm working with, but also associates who I work with in the freight forwarding industry. So it's basically a picture of what I'm hearing and seeing from both associates I work with and clients I work for. So to start off with, and this covers really imports as well as exports. The impact, really, the general picture we're seeing can be broken down into a few areas. And a lot of this stems from the first thing that happened, or one of the first things I should say that happened at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic, was the massive reduction in passenger aircraft. Now, I'm sure you're probably all aware, but a lot of freight actually moves in passenger aircraft, that the holds of passenger aircraft are used to carry freight. So naturally, if there are no passenger aircraft or highly reduced numbers of passenger aircraft flying, then you end up getting a big reduction in the overall capacity for freight, which means freight forwarders and the like have a reduced ability to offer air freight as a service, and therefore fewer aircraft available to carry the freight is going to have a big impact on not only the time frame in which you can export and import your goods, but also the cost of doing so. A quick note on couriers in relation to that. What has been quite interesting is that we've seen couriers who are able to offer they have their own fleets of aircraft, the likes of TNT and DHL, and these sorts of people have their own fleets. And normally you would envisage those sort of companies were dealing with the smaller packages, the smaller items that you were importing and exporting. And they wouldn't be so competitive on the larger bulk items. But actually what we've seen is, yes, their prices have gone up quite considerably on the smaller stuff, but actually they are starting to get more competitive on some of the larger items, because they've got their own fleets. They've got more flexibility in terms of what they move and how they move it. So it might, I had an instance with a company just recently who we ended up importing something from some bulk equipment from China, which would normally be done through a freight forwarder. We actually used a courier instead because they were actually more competitive in these times. So be a bit open-minded as to who you might start using nowadays to move your freight around, because it might be that other people do have better availability and rates that you might not have considered in the past. So with the reduction and the absence of passenger aircraft, obviously we're more reliant on freighter only aircraft. So obviously a supply and demand situation kicks in there, and that's driving rates up all over the place. By that I mean all routes, no matter where in the world. To give you an example, we're looking at rates which are probably 3, if not 4 times higher than they would normally be, and in some instances a lot higher than that, which I'll come to in a bit. In terms of your planning for your import and your export, what we've found in particular is it's taking us a lot longer to get quotes from freight forwarders, and it's taking them a lot longer to process orders. So I know it's difficult, but sort of you are going to experience longer delays, both on the quotation and the order processing side of things, with the airlines and the freight forwarders. Also, there'll be a reduced validity of those quotes that you do get, and that's because, truly speaking, rates are changing daily. So an air freight quote that you get now for an import or for an export might not be valid tomorrow, and the price might well have changed tomorrow. So please do be aware of that. There are some places which no airlines are flying to. Those are pretty much reduced now. They're very few and far between, really. Most places are open for business in one form or another. However, there are a few anomalies on that. Gambia, for some reason, is one in particular where we just don't seem to be being able to get any freight to at all at the moment. And to be totally honest with you, we're a bit unsure as to whether that is because there's a lack of demand, there's a lack of freight to move to these countries, or whether it's an unwillingness by the airlines to take the risk on putting on flights to those countries. That's still not really certain, but the general picture that I'd want you to leave you is that there are very few places in the world now where we can't get air freight either out of or into. And I'll talk about a couple of specific examples on that later. So one of the other things that's been feeding into this general situation we have, where there's a lack of availability and increased pricing on air freight in particular, is I'm sure if anything like me, you've probably had all kinds of LinkedIn requests from people you've never heard of from before in China, who are saying, yes, we can supply you with PPE equipment. And that is symbolic, really, of the amount of companies who are adapting and trying to produce PPE equipment because they see it as a sudden opportunity for them. That in turn is giving some Chinese manufacturers a bit of a bad reputation, because there's been a lot of examples where product just isn't up to quality, up to standard. It's not what people ordered, it's not what people expected. So I just wanted to share with you an example of some of the typical responses we're getting from agents in China in terms of not being able to get goods out of China. The government there has created what they're calling a white list, and if PPE suppliers are not on that white list, then they will not be given an export license. So the writing there in blue on the screen is just one example of a response we had from an agent in China, which basically is symbolic of the Chinese government trying to tighten down on unqualified goods leaving the country. So they are expanding on that, though, as well, in terms of having a tighter control on export licenses from China. So if you're struggling to get your supply chain, your supply goods out of China, that might be one reason why, because things are being more tightly controlled there. There are more checks on goods at customs leaving the country to check that they're complying with the export licenses that have been issued. Because that was a situation that was derived out of the supply of PPE equipment, unfortunately, a lot of carriers, freight carriers, sort of cottoned onto that, and by tracking commodity codes for the consignments that they were handling, they very quickly ramped up the air freight rates for PPE equipment in particular. An example, we were getting quotes of $33 a kilo for if the commodity was PPE equipment, which is probably 6 or 7 times higher than it really should be. So that was really having a big dramatic effect on people's supply chain. And then that started feeding into all other freight as well. So it wasn't just PPE; it had a knock-on effect of air freight in all product ranges. So unfortunately, yes, we did see quite a bit of profiteering going on from that. And I'm sure I'm probably not telling you anything new here. You've probably witnessed that yourselves in your supply chain in terms of your freight costs going up dramatically from your suppliers and your freight forwarders or your airliners, or indeed if your suppliers are providing the freight for you, then I'm sure their charges will have gone up also. In terms of sea freight, the effect hasn't been quite as dramatic as we've seen in the air freight. But talking from my personal experience and that of my associates, yes, there is a big reduction in capacity. Liners are putting on fewer vessels, so there are fewer vessels operating because of reduction in staff, and the procedures that they're having to work under now means there is less capacity, so there are fewer vessels sailing. The impact that will have on you in terms of booking things to go by sea freight is that you might have to look further ahead. So if there had been a booking, if there had been a sailing typically once a week for the destination that you were looking at, or for the supply that you were looking to bring in from the country, it might now only be once every 10 days, once every 2 or 3 weeks. So you're going to have to get used to booking further ahead for things, and that relates back into planning and a knock-on effect for your planning procedures internally. And again, obviously, because of the reduced capacity, we are naturally seeing higher rates to all destinations around the globe, unfortunately. The ports are mainly still operating. They obviously have to operate now under different procedures. They are operating with reduced staffing levels, so they're having to get used to a different way of operating. That is going to have a knock-on effect to you, because it will mean slower process times in terms of processing your goods through the port and through customs. So it may take you longer to clear your goods through customs and to physically get them out off the vessel, through the port and back on the road, either to your customer or into your goods inwards as well. So those are the issues we're seeing on the air freight and the sea freight. In terms of how things are going to move forward from that existing situation, it varies quite considerably from country to country. So some countries have much tighter controls than others. Just to run you through a couple of examples, New Zealand in particular, just until recently, New Zealand airports in terms of freight were operating at what they call a level 4 emergency level, which basically was restricting all freight coming into New Zealand. We had one example with a company just recently where we managed to get the goods into New Zealand, but it was only because, fortunately for them, they operate in the healthcare sector, and therefore they were able to write a letter which we submitted to the New Zealand authorities, customs authorities, explaining what the product was used for, and they gave us authorization for the goods to be imported into the country. So there were very tight controls in terms of getting goods into New Zealand. That has now relaxed slightly, but it is worth checking in some of these places before you send goods that you will be able to get them cleared into the country. Because if you don't, and you send the goods over there and they get held up because the authorities won't let them in, or there are no flights going into that country, then if the freight forwarder or the courier, whoever you use to carry those goods for you, they're going to start charging you for storing the goods whilst this situation is resolved until the airports do open again and allow product in. Australia, what we're seeing there, yeah, again, they've had very tight controls. Again, it's opening up slightly more now. They are putting priority on goods moving between Australia and New Zealand. They're focusing on giving that traffic a priority before they then open up everywhere else. In terms of India, we saw, just as an example, we saw a complete shutdown for about 5 days. There were no exit flights from India for about 5 days. That situation is okay again now. There are flights now, but it's still under review. And I mentioned Gambia earlier. So just be aware and make sure you do these checks before you're either trying to buy products from wherever you're buying them from and exporting them as well. The Far East is opening up. There's a lot more freight moving both in and out of the Far East now. We're also starting to see some parts of Europe opening up as well, in terms of the movement of goods and the operations there. A point that Adrian was talking about in his presentation, I picked up on as well there. Do we know whether there's going to be a steep or a gradual increase in demand? That's very difficult to say, and it's nobody really knows, and it'll be different, obviously, from sector to sector. So you have to try and think about it from your own point of view in terms of the product that you're working with and the way that is used in your target markets. Again, maybe to give you an example, an associate of mine, we work with a company who ship, on average, they ship about 20 container loads a month of malt to Australia, which is used by their breweries over there. So on average, 20 a month. In April, they didn't send any containers at all. Now, obviously, to put that into perspective, then in terms of coming out of the lockdown, the customer has to think, okay, well, that situation is not going to change until bars and restaurants, that kind of thing, pubs, start opening up again, and they start allowing people back out into the pubs and bars. That's only going to be a gradual, phased approach, and I think that will be the same for most countries. So yes, demand will start picking up again when that happens, but it will be a gradual thing for them. So it's about assessing your market and how your product is used and what impact COVID has on your particular product demand. So that was really a review of how we're seeing the movement of goods being affected. I want to just keep an eye on time here. I wanted to just, however, quickly leave you with a tool that I use for people in terms of market selection and how you could maybe build in an element of the COVID analysis into that process. I always encourage people to try and take a proactive approach to export market selection in terms of understanding what it is that makes a market attractive to you as an organization, you as an individual company, also for your particular sector, but but for you as an individual business. How you go about identifying and prioritizing those markets. As I said, how we build in the COVID-19 impact of that. And that's really, building that impact is really understanding what stage each individual target market is at in terms of either its lockdown or its COVID infection rates, whether they're increasing, decreasing. So look at your individual target markets and how they're being impacted by COVID-19. And the severity that the pandemic is having on the economy in your specific target markets, and then try and judge, if you can. It's a very tricky thing to do, I understand. Judge the sort of the bounce back time as a result of that. So in order to do that, one thing I wanted to express really is how important it is to keep talking to your overseas customers, even though you might not be doing much business with them at the moment. Keep talking to them, find out the situation in their country, and your suppliers too, from that matter, because that will help you get your forecasts in place for that particular market, which will then help inform how you prioritize your markets, whether that then be rebuilding existing markets or targeting new ones. So the process I use for this really is I like to break things down into bite-sized chunks so it doesn't become quite so daunting. And I do that through a three-phased approach: strategic, tactical, and operational. So at the strategic level, just to give you a quick run through of this so you can see how it might be used within your organizations. What is it that makes an attractive export market for us? These are the sort of questions you're asking yourselves at the strategic phase. So understanding who it is who's buying your product, using your product. So therefore, do I need to find a country where there's a swelling middle class with an increasing disposable income, or am I looking for countries where there's an increase in investment from the government into infrastructure, whether that be IT or roads and railways? So understanding the economic picture within the country and the demographic of your customer and where those people are around the world. Think about the practical issues. Do I have to adapt my product to cover legislation within the target market? How easy is it to do business there? How bureaucratic is it? How easy is it or quick is it to get my product to that market? And is it easy to move it around within the target market? Those are some of the practical issues. The duties and licenses that you might have to, might be applied to your product to get them to that market. Then how do I go about identifying my best target markets? How do I come up with my priority list? I'll show you what I do in a minute. And then be honest with yourselves in terms of your internal resources. How many markets can we realistically handle? I think it's better to penetrate a few markets really, really deeply rather than take a scattergun approach and try to handle hundreds of markets at the same time. So the way I do that in terms of selecting export markets is basically use a funnel. So we put in all the countries in the top, and through a series of gates within that funnel, we eliminate markets based on the criteria that you set on the previous slide in terms of what it is that makes an attractive market for you. So building COVID into that, this is maybe as you're doing your data collection for each target market, there's lots of statistics out there. This is just one example I picked up for you. So COVID cases per million inhabitants. So this relates it to the size of the market and how many cases there've been per population. And then you want to apply that to whether this is a market that you're looking at in terms of a long-term strategy, and therefore the weighting that you apply to this particular category in your gateway won't be as great, because if you're looking at it as a long-term market, then the impact won't be so high. But if you're looking at it in terms of short to mid-term, i.e. is that a market you're currently exporting to or importing from, then the impact will be higher and it may be more of an important criteria for you. So you can use data like that to feed into your strategy. So just to show you how it works, this is an example we did for a company making gin and vodka. These are some of so you start off by laying out your criteria for what it is that makes a market attractive to you as a business. And keep it as individual as you can to your specific business in relation to your size and your product message and product fit and everything like that. So you collect that sort of criteria set, and then you simply lay it out in whatever format suits you. This is how I use it. So you'd have all your criteria there along the top. You say this was something we did for a gin and vodka manufacturer, so the criteria there would change for you. And then you use a traffic light system to try and identify where the best markets are for you. And you eliminate the countries that have any red flags and progress to green ones. So you do your gateway system analysis by having all these different gateways, knocking countries out. So you're getting down to more of a manageable number of countries that you can then compare against each other to then create a priority list from. There's lots of ways you can get help at this phase. You know, contactors like myself and my peers, companies who do the same thing as me, but also World Bank, HMRC, World Trade Organizations, trade journals, trade associations. There's lots of sources for data out there. As I say, depending on what sector you're in, these are just a few examples. The tactical phase is more about the actual specific market. So what is my route to market? Is it distributors, direct, that kind of thing? How do we select those people? How do we manage and develop them? And then in terms of how you select them, then it's very similar to what you did about selecting your target market. What is it that makes a distributor attractive to me? What sort of company are we looking for? Do we want someone big who's got lots of salesmen out on the road, or do we want to prefer to work with someone much smaller who may be able to dedicate more time to my particular brand? So again, build up your picture of what it is, who it is you want to work with, and set some criteria that you want your ideal overseas partner to have. Again, there's lots of ways to get help on that, from Chambers of Commerce, DIT, companies like mine, internal reviews, internal work, can you handle it yourselves, and networking. I'm a big believer in peer-to-peer networking, so talk to your sector colleagues. And then the operational phase is the final phase, and that's very much about the nuts and bolts of it. So the implications on your time, the documentation, your production capacity, the bureaucracy, can we handle the increased admin, the travel, the certification, all these kinds of things. The important thing to remember about the operational phase is the timing of it. It needs to be done in conjunction with the first phase, the strategic phase, because that will tie into your market selection, and because each different market will be impacted differently by the issues on here, because they all have different standards and different bureaucracy rates. And again, so as I say, do that. These are just a couple of examples where people got it wrong and come to us for help to unpick it after they'd actually sold stuff into the market and realised they couldn't get the right product approvals. So that's going to cost you a lot of time and a lot of money to put that right, and it's too late. Again, same sort of places to get help from. Talk to your bank, talk to the Chamber of Commerce, companies like mine. UK Export Finance will help in terms of the financing some of the larger projects that you might be dealing with. So again, there's a wide variety, and I can share all this information with delegates afterwards, so you have access to this if you need it. And then some additional practicalities to think about in terms of some of the practicalities there. Incoterms are hugely important, but that's a completely another section. Consider your FX strategy. Think about how you're going to get paid, how you're going to move your goods, or how you're going to protect your brand. There's lots of other things to think about in terms of your overall strategy and your export process, and we can talk about those further another time. So I hope that's been of some use to you all in terms of splitting out the phases of the presentation, with a review of the current situation in terms of physical movement of goods through ports, and then a bit of strategy work on identifying, using this time that you have to identify target markets overseas. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was really helpful. So I'm just going to quickly, we had one question for Adrian on the chat, which I know he has gone back to, but just for the purposes of hopefully everybody hearing, are you happy to just go over that question again?
Yeah, I think it was about national coverage, and it is a national programme, or billed as a national programme, although it excludes Scotland and Wales, and it also excludes Devon and Cornwall, East Anglia, and Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, who have elected not to participate, but and Greater London is the last one, but the rest of the country is included. And the only difference to the 33% grant levels that I mentioned is that there are certain parts of the country that are termed transitional, one of which is Greater Lincolnshire, for example, where the grant level support is 43%. But for all of SEMLEP territory, it's 33%.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And we do have just one question that's just come in for you, Jim. How is the gluten-free market doing? What is the best way to find out if there is a need of a certain product in a sector in the UK?
In the UK,
yeah.
So in terms of gluten-free, then yeah, it's obviously a huge growing demand from what we've seen. There's what I've seen in terms of the UK market is there's a wider availability now of gluten-free products which are coming in from places you might not have considered before. So I know there's product coming in from Ethiopia, where they have a natural diet which is naturally gluten-free. So there's a wider variety of product coming into that into the UK market because the demand is there. So certainly there's a big growth in gluten-free products domestically here in the UK. Internationally, then certainly we're seeing an increase in demand in the Middle East, in Scandinavia, some parts of Northern America, Canada. Gluten-free products are in high demand in lots of places. So it's about prioritizing them and seeing what's right for your particular company. Whether you're an importer and trying to serve the UK market, what's your channel to market going to be? Are you trying to get into the supermarkets, or are you going for the more independent health shop, that type of thing? So always, I'd say bring it down to you and your individual company rather than trying to look at the big global picture. But certainly, it's a growth sector, and the movement of goods is there. We can move goods, and we can access goods. So it's practical. It's certainly possible, and feasible.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for questions. If no one has anything else, there's nothing else coming up in the chat. So we have recorded the session today, and that'll be available hopefully later today online. You'll all be sent round the link to access that, and hopefully Jim and Adrian will be happy to share their slide decks as well, and that will all go out on the link for you later on this afternoon, so you can access it at any time. I've just left on the screen here contact details for the Growth Hub, phone number and email address. If you have got any other questions, we can direct those to Adrian or Jim or to the other appropriate people. So thank you once again, Adrian and Jim, for that this morning, and thank you everybody else for joining us, and take care.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.